Hello, good evening, and welcome to PM Express. Education has become a hot button issue in this year's elections. I borrow the expressions of Dr. Mensah Otabil. Now, it has taken center stage in the elections as almost every political party is promising one thing or the other. While the main opposition MPP's policy direction is free, quality senior high school education, the NDC seeks to make senior high school progressively free by 2016. So the issue is that there are many promises that have been bandied around. But what is actually the true status of our educational system, senior high school? And what do we need? Do we need free? Do we need quality? Do we need progressively free? Tonight on PM Express, we will put the free senior high school policy on the table. We will devoid it of all the political propaganda and get to the bottom of it, find out what the facts really are and what the country can support. As we go into the elections, we hope that these will help shape the policy directions for everyone to be well informed about what plagues us as a country, what solutions we can afford, and what we need as a country. My name is Stephen Enti, and my guest tonight is Bright Simmons. Bright is Director of Development Research at Imani Ghana. Of course, Bright is also an entrepreneur, but tonight he will put his entrepreneurship gap aside and we'll talk education. It's great to have you here, Bright.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, you are passionate, very passionate about the education debate. I need to ask you, do you think of all the different positions, political positions that have come forth, are you able to read in between the lines to see where, as a country, it will be favorable for us?
Tough question. I mean, we haven't looked at education from the point of view of the party political positions, except in the respect in which we disagree, or the extent to which we disagree. We have not done a comparative
and the extent,
analysis.
let's put on the extent to which you disagree is the free senior high school.
No, so first of all, we believe that the whole country has become or have been taken for a ride in that even though this education debate is extremely important, some will say this is the first time an election has begun to turn around a matter of policy. And it was a great opportunity for us to look critically at the education system and perhaps offer a diagnosis of what really is wrong with it and see how we can holistically address education in Ghana. Unfortunately, the debate has taken a turn towards, in my view, the shallow and in some instances, the ridiculous. And we haven't therefore had the opportunity to examine the education system or the educational system root, stem, and branch, which is what we should do. This whole "are you for free or are you not for free" debate, in my view, is an attempt to evade the rather more fundamental, rather more challenging questions that we should be asking ourselves.
And what are the challenging questions we should be asking ourselves?
Clearly, do we want to have an educational system where the most primary actors in that system, the teachers, are civil servants? Because what people don't realize is that teachers in this country are public servants. And public servants are regimented. So there's a certain hierarchy that you go through, and typically it's very hard once you've developed such a system for seniority not to be simply measured by how long one has stayed in the service. And the education service, in my view, requires a complete and radical transformation. It has to become more community-based. I think schools have to become, particularly secondary schools, have to become trusts. Headmasters have to be able to hire and fire.
No, you're saying a lot of things. We'll take it easy. I mean, you were saying that you think that we've come to the point where secondary schools have to be community-based, and then schools have to become trusts. I mean, let's break it down.
No, what I mean is that some of them have to become community-based to the extent to which the community itself can outline a certain focus for them. I've argued that the trust-based approach is much more effective, particularly if it allows local leadership. I want a headmaster to be sufficiently responsible for the quality of teaching in that school. And that means that the headmaster should be able, not beyond ordinary discipline, to also enforce performance standards that are not necessarily regimented. By regimented, I mean that because we have a structure where people go through the ranks, from superintendent through principal superintendent, all the way through assistant director, it has created almost a military type arrangement and a civil service type mentality in the teaching force. And I feel that in a modern system, you need sufficient flexibility and autonomy at the level of the school for headmasters to be set, to be given a budget and to be given clear performance measurement, performance targets to meet. And if you're unable to meet that, to suffer the consequences. But if you have a system where they don't have sufficient autonomy, and a lot of that, the power in the management of schools is left to a central body, and boards of governors don't really manage the school in the way that you typically manage an autonomous body, and they are basically operating within a mandate set centrally.
This kind of school system you're talking about, we've never had it. So are you suggesting a total overhaul
of education
system?
We've actually had it in large swathes of the education system. Don't forget that a lot of the schools that were mission schools were not co-opted into the public system until quite late. I mean, there are schools like St. Francis Xavier and others in the north, which actually became part of the public school system in the Fourth Republic. So the default position hasn't been that you have a teaching staff that is part of the public service, and that you have school administrations that are more or less managed on the basis of fiat or the basis of instructions from a central educational authority. We've had different arrangements. When Dr. Kwame Nkrumah set up Ghana National College and things like that, I think the whole philosophy of having a public school system began to emerge. And over the years, I believe we haven't had the courage and the confidence to look fundamentally at whether this is how we want to organize our teaching force. But beyond that, also there are issues of curricular development and curriculum management. I believe that the continuous centralization of curriculum development within a certain few group of experts, particularly in the University of Legon, Cape Coast, and Winneba, have created a lack of dynamism in the curriculum.
And how should that be addressed?
I believe that sufficient decentralization around curriculum development will allow experimentation at different levels and different schools, so that we begin to see which schools and which approaches are better. Once you have a very monolithic system, then with a final exam where everybody is learning towards a certain syllabus, and then everybody goes and write that exam, if the system gets broken, it gets broken throughout. And I don't think sometimes we measure the right things. I mean, I had a very good chunk of my education in Ghana. I believe what we consider to be worthy of
knowledge or education?
No, worthy of promotion and worthy of encouragement, etc. Doesn't always tend to be the most important, viable and important thing. And so I will address the issue of free education. I'm not skirting that question at all. But I was just saying that this would have been a great opportunity for us as a nation to ask some of the hard questions about education, to ask issues about how we're going to create a system where technical education is repositioned as important, where we've created a cultural system which doesn't allow that to happen. I don't see how going forward we can do that anymore. People have just decided that technical and vocational education is for the less qualified and for the less competent. We've made that decision as a country. Because we've allowed it culturally to grow. And it's not acquired an organic character. So you don't just get up tomorrow.
But both the NDC and the MPP have promised that when they come when they get our mandate to form the next government, they will both address these technical
would they do it through,
differently.
Would they do it?
I mean, the MPP says through an apprenticeship system.
How? An apprenticeship how?
An apprenticeship system where, I mean, the people will go through an apprenticeship system where, like Swami Magazine, they will equip the place. Then people who will go through there will be certified. I mean, I think I remember these coming forth from the MPP. While the NDC also says that they will upgrade the polytechnics to university status.
Well, but it doesn't address the fundamental point, which is that as far as we are concerned now in Ghana, if you take the top 100 schools in Ghana, how many technical schools will you personally count among them? I mean, you were schooled in Ghana. Yeah. You have a fair understanding of what the ordinary Ghanaian parent and student considers to be a good school. Do you believe that if you were to count 1 to 100, you will find a technical school that you believe is worthy of comparison with the Presex and the what do you call the Achimotes and the Fancy Pims and the St. Augustine's and the Prempers. Do you believe that?
No.
And none of these schools are technical schools. If they are arguing that they are going to make technical courses part of the main curriculum in secondary school across the board, that might be interesting, but that will still not change the fact that the majority of people will still want to go and pursue the formal sciences or want to go and pursue business and general arts and the rest. That has created a cultural disdain for the technical sciences. The fact also that when we are in school, we are forced to specialize without necessarily acquiring any specialist skills. So you are said to be a science student when you are in secondary school, and yet still your understanding of experimental science is very low. The laboratories are highly under-equipped. Generally speaking, we don't think quantitatively. And, we live in a country where anytime you mention numbers, people say it's technical. It tells you about the way that the culture of ideas and the climate of ideas have nurtured all of us, which is why there is this fear of number and this fear of. I often argue that the Woyomi scandal, erupted because a lot of the bureaucrats, as soon as they saw there were numbers involved and there was somebody started talking about financial engineering, they got scared and didn't want to really touch it. But that's just by the way. But I'm just arguing that as a country, we're not really one that favors quantitative thinking. We don't look at our reports. Have you looked at the ministerial reports? How often do you see graphs and diagrams and bar charts and the rest of it? You look critically. You find out that very often there's a lot of narrative and a lot of text. So we naturally not mathematically inclined. We are not quantitatively inclined. We don't have a respect
which is
for
dangerous for a country aiming to upper middle income.
Very good, because as a country we haven't exercised we haven't done the best we could to improve upon the respect, or rather we haven't shown sufficient respect to the quantitative sciences, to technical knowledge, to analysis. I very often find that, I'm on Facebook a lot, and I very often find that there is a subtext in the response that I get when I try to engage in debate. People think you're either being too academic or we don't have a natural curiosity towards these things. We think, and I feel that part of that is because of our educational training. We just don't find those things exciting. And we had rather somebody was flowery and, was saying things we already know. We are not very curious. I don't see often an attempt to say, here is, a controversy on the table. Why don't we go underneath the subject matter and find out what an underpin is? I find that people are satisfied with a very, initial discussion of the matter. There isn't a national temperament which is directed towards curiosity, inquisitiveness, and I think a lot of that is to do with the educational system, and those things need to be addressed.
And so
it's not necessarily, some talk about quality, not quality, and I think these are all simplistic descriptions. What do you mean by quality? There are complex cultural dynamics around what makes an education.
From your expose, it makes me feel that our educational system is really not up to scratch to international standards, and that the focus should be that reorienting the entire educational system to bring us up to the measure of what is suitable for us to reach upper middle income.
There will be an empirical basis for your assertion, in that if you look at the international comparisons for universities, for instance, the Ghanaian universities don't do very well. If you look at continental rankings, we've never really done very well. Our universities have not been performed very creditably. Once they did an assessment based on websites, and then I saw the KNUST feature. But when there's been international assessments, we haven't done very well. Then there's been another international maths and science exam that they run in multiple countries across the world, where they do it, I think K-12, which here would be K-12 would be up to SS3, thereabout, and SHS3, and they haven't. We haven't performed very creditably. Yes, the argument is also that Ghanaian students go outside and perform. And I think that is an emphasis on the very elite who manage to get into these top schools. But the vast majority of them struggle in that. When you look at employers and the way that employers complain about talent available in the local market, it's quite clear they don't find suitable material when they need to. But part of it is also easily evident in the structure of the economy. Why is it that when somebody sets up a shop and that's call centers, or what do we call them, communication centers, within a very short span of time, everybody's doing communication centers, as opposed to somebody quickly finding out an alternative around it, or things like that. So the lack of diversity in the economy, and the lack of even diversity in the informal sector, all gives you an indication that the education system is not making people sufficiently inquisitive. There are alternative explanations, because if you look at countries like China and countries like India, where often the same argument is made that people are not inquisitive and curious and the rest of it, they tend to be at least solid in the technical disciplines. So if they are mathematicians, they tend to be very good mathematicians. So they are highly lopsided. In our case, even when it comes to the high specialization, I don't think we do that well. But I think now I'm digressing. The fundamental point is that we are not producing sufficient graduates, or rather graduates in sufficient number to fill critical gaps. And we are seeing expatriates coming for basic kind of activities in the economy that we should be doing ourselves. We are not producing entrepreneurs in sufficient quantities who are being innovative enough. So look at our import dependency. To the extent that that is a problem generally in Africa, you might argue that it's just a stage of our development and the rest of it. But we have seen regional differences in Asia, where countries like South Korea, Malaysia, and the rest have quickly outpaced countries like Cambodia and Burma and Myanmar and others. So there is evidence that through leadership, through improved focus on the important things that matter, countries can break from regional trends. Insofar as Ghana hasn't done very well. I mean, we've looked at all these inflation figures and the rest of it, and we appear to believe we are doing dramatically well. But it's not evident in a whole range of other numbers that you look at. When you look at, for instance, patent filings, Ghana is, I think Latvia files more patents as that tiny country than the whole of West Africa in a year. So we are not filing patents as an example. That tells you are not being highly innovative. Clearly, you're not competitive on an international scale. We are not doing groundbreaking research. When you look at the CSR and the rest of it, you look at the output, how often are they publishing in international journals? So there's so many empirical measures they can use to measure evidently that we are not doing very well. The fact that we are not doing dramatically worse than maybe some other African country is no comfort.
Where should we begin to fix the solution?
First of all, we need to, there are a lot of people in education in this country who have given solid recommendations. The Dr. Patrick Ewua has, there have been, I think Dr. Spiogabra, now that he's become Chancellor of Dominion University, has made some comments as well. Dr. Otabil talks about it all the time, and he has, he's founder of Central University. And so there have been attempts to try and propose various things. I believe that there are a couple of big things that ought to happen. One of them have to be the reorganization of the teaching force as a public service. I think that is a fundamental blocker because it prevents reform. It makes headmasters unaccountable because you don't give them full autonomy. And because they don't have full autonomy, they cannot really account for a specific strategy. If you set up a business plan for a school and my hands are tied behind my back because everything I have to do, I have to look at the GES, that's a challenge. And then we get to the big issue that is on the table, which is financing of schools. The average amount of money we spend on a student is small, even if we accept the fact that a lot of it gets wasted. If my recollection is right, I think 857 Ghana cedis was the average per head in secondary school. That last time I checked. This is the Ministry of Education's 2008 report. If that is the case, and you look at this country like South Korea, where of the $20,000 per year that they spend on students, parents foot $11,000 of it. It gives you a dramatic understanding of where we are as a country, because you are talking about spending $400 and something on a student. Of course, it's higher perhaps than your GDP per capita. No, now it's not even higher than our GDP per capita. I mean, it's lower than our GDP per capita, significantly lower than our GDP per capita. So your ability to actually dramatically enrich the offerings available to that student is constrained by the fact that you're not spending enough on that child. If somebody is spending $20,000 per student, and you are spending something like $400 per student, you can't expect the same outcomes. Yeah. That is number one. So we are spending less per student. Now, how do you address that problem? You find out ways and mechanisms that allow you to increase the resource per child. That's number one. And that's, okay, number two, after you reorganize your teaching force. What are the proposals that have been put forward to increase the amount of money we are spending on students? And why do we need to spend more money on students? When I was in secondary school in Ghana, it was official school policy not to have detergents to clean the school. So when we were in secondary school, students would bring detergents from home that we were supposed to use for washing their clothing and washing their utensils. They would bring that to wash the bathroom. And if students didn't want to do so, or there wasn't sufficient supervision, then the bathroom didn't get cleaned with detergents. Clearly, you're going to have very healthy students that way. When we were in secondary school, the meals were often unbalanced. So your developmental progress as a child is affected. When we were in secondary school, the libraries were not properly indexed. So very often we didn't even know the resources that we had in the school library. Our school library was nothing to write home about anyway. The laboratories had very little ability to make use of instructional material because you didn't have any DVDs or stored files and the rest of it. And it depended entirely on the teacher's recollection. And that meant that we had a great chemistry teacher, but a terrible physics teacher, a terrible biology teacher, created lasting complications. Most of the students that left from my school who went on to further education overseas, I will reckon that of the science students, 90% shifted focus. Only those who stayed in Ghana were often very lucky enough to go and do medicine.
When I was a science student, but
no, the majority shifted focus.
The struggle that I went through to, pass my exam and get a better appreciation of the practical relevance of what I was doing meant that after sixth form, I thought, no, time.
Most people did the same. Most people did the same. So why is that? Partly because the teachers are not sufficiently motivated, partly also because teachers are not sufficiently well trained. Don't forget that. It's also training of teachers, motivation of teachers, an ability to supervise teachers. And as I've said, you have structures which are governance structures that prevent teachers from becoming more accountable, etc. You have all these problems. You have problems with material. There are schools where people haven't seen computers before. You can't run any scientific discipline today if you don't understand computing, or at least how computing interacts with your field. So it's hard to conceive of an education system that will turn out high quality graduates. Then the argument is made that we've done it before in the past. But you've done it before in the past in the context of the past. When 1 ton of cocoa could conceivably buy you, or 2 tons of cocoa could conceivably buy you a VW Beetle. Now looking at the current situation, you need maybe 10 tons of cocoa to do that. What that means is that your relative productivity as a country and the global productivity is diverging. That also means that your educational system and its ability to turn products that are globally competitive is also divergent. Because your cocoa, your growing of cocoa is no longer as productive as somebody making cars. And as that gap widens, your education system's relevance to global productivity becomes clearly compromised. Now, my argument is that for that reason, we cannot say that in the past we trained the Kofi Annans and the rest. We have to look at the majority of the, when we say today that a lot of Ghanaians are illiterate, it comes from the education policy of the past. So glamorizing the past is ridiculous in my view, because it's that past that have created the high literacy rate that we are complaining of today.
Well, you're watching PM Express, and my guest tonight is Bright Simmons, who is Director of Development Research at Imani. You heard it. The issue of education is not only narrowed down to access and then free. So we'll return after a short break to PM Express to discuss this. We're discussing education. Now, we've spoken a lot about, Bright, we've spoken a lot about the core problem that we have in this country on education. Let's come back to the issue of free senior high school as against the other one of progressively free. I mean, I feel that the only difference between the two is that one wants the free now, the other wants the free spread over time. Are we all right as a country to be seeing it this way, in the eyes of the spectacle of the two political parties?
Which is why the current controversy and all the what do you call
furore,
it, the fireworks and
it amazes you, right?
Because there are six parties and then 2 independent candidates or whatever. None of them have fundamentally different ideas about education, really. I mean, all of them are saying relatively the same kind of things. One argues, though, that the affordability issue is so important that without addressing it first, you are sacrificing a lot of talent. While others are arguing that, no, in actual fact, there is an issue to do with the resources that are available to the student in the first place, and that without improving on those resources, even the affordability issues. So within those two debates and the narrow agenda they've set for themselves, there are credible arguments on both sides. The challenge emanates from not allowing yourself to be confined to that narrow agenda by politicians, getting out of it and looking in broad terms at what really is ailing our educational system and trying to fix it. But to address that narrow issue of free, we have to start from 3 premises, and very often those 3 premises get confused with each other. There's a rationale argument, that is, why should we do free SHS, or why should we make SHS free? There is an implementation dynamic, which is how effectively will it be to implement this free return, given our current situation.
Yeah.
There isn't a zero or a blank plate. We have a legacy system that is already there, and you are trying to create something new. So how will that, play out? Then the third is a costing issue, which is that even if we could do it because we have everything aligned to do it, and even if it was a good thing to do in and of itself, the principle itself was sound, how much will it cost and can we afford it? They are all three very different debates. And all of them should be had on a different set of, premises. It's not mixing them up has created confusion. So let's start with the rationale.
Yeah.
If you decide that I want to implement a free SHS policy, then the goal is why? Then the argument is that, well, there's several people in Ghana who cannot afford secondary school education if it's not free. Then the question becomes, what is the policy for making it affordable to those people? Not necessarily why should we have free education. Unless you identify something else. If your point is that, but there is another argument that could have been made. You could have made a socialist argument that education is such a defining social institution that because it's such a defining social institution, we should have a situation where everybody goes through the same processes for purposes of egalitarianism. You understand what I mean? And if you made that kind of argument, then your argument will be completely different from somebody who said it's because some people cannot pay. You'll be saying that no, education, like certain aspects of our social life, is such that everybody in the country must experience it the same way for us to have an egalitarian society. But that might imply abolishing private education, which is what they have done in Cuba.
Yeah.
You understand me? Or which is what they have done in North Korea, where they've abandoned private schools and compelled everybody to use the public system because we all want all of us to be in it together. Education shapes opportunity. So we should all experience education the same way. You can have that argument. Nobody has made that argument in Ghana. The argument that I've heard is that some people cannot afford to go to school.
So they must be encouraged to go.
But if you put it that way, then in my view, the question becomes, how can we make it possible for those people not to be left out? It's not necessarily why we should have free education or free SHS. Your question and its responses set is different from the beginning. In my view, if the goal is that some people cannot pay, your first goal is to try and find out how many they are. That is a matter for empirical research.
Yeah.
If you discover
that shouldn't be difficult if we had a good data system in this country.
Even from pure analytics, you can say, okay, how many people leave JSS and don't enter secondary school?
But are qualified too.
Very good. So you apply the second filter, which is the qualification part of it. Then the third filter becomes, where do they come from? If it turns out that 99% of them come from rural areas, then it might be that the policy should only apply to rural areas. If it happens that they are fairly spread across, then the question becomes, why don't you do a survey of 5,000 of these people and find out what the reasons were why they dropped out? Because there could be two reasons, or there could be several reasons. Two very important ones, even when we accept that money is the issue, could be that they are so poor they have to work to feed their family and themselves. If I'm so poor that I don't see myself going forward in the educational process and then going to university, etc., because now the family, let's say my mom is a single mom, I'm an only child, my mom is ill, and we live in a very poor neighborhood in Ghana. How am I going to continue to go to school when my mom needs money and I have to go and make money? So then it's okay, how many people are of that category? How many people are of the other category? Which is that they will want to go, but they are, they don't want to earn money. They want to go to school, they just can't afford to pay the fees. If the issue is that there's a lot more in the first category, and I suspect there's a lot more. Why? Because we've had virtually free education in the North for a long time. But we've also seen the biggest exodus of young people from that part of the country than anywhere else.
Yeah.
And I suspect a lot of those people is because of the fact that they don't really see a future for themselves in education. Some of them just are not qualified because they don't pass the exam, a whole range of other things. But the question becomes that, why is somebody not going to school? And I'm saying that if it's a matter of the fact that they are so poor that without that, they can't go, then your issue is not just free SHS. Your issue is how do you expand your Less Debt program or some other program to give money to that family? Because you have to pay them to forfeit the opportunity cost of education, which is the lost income from potential employment, even though that employment may be very bad or may be child labor. You understand what I'm going?
Yeah,
then if you say, okay, we've done all that analysis, we found out that still 80% of the people who don't go to school is due to the fact that they cannot afford fees. Then you have another analysis, which is that of the total population of school-going people, how many are they? If it's 90%, then we are in a crisis point as a country. But then that will probably also mean that the 90%, if 90% of people can't go to school because they can't afford fees, then the dynamics in the country are such that we are so poor we don't have enough taxation. So your answer may still be that, yes, okay, I have to make it free, but 90% of people can't go without it. But the question is, how are you going to pay for it? So now you see that you skipped over to the third part of the debate, which is cost. But you're not there yet. You're just going to rationale. If, however, it's not 90%, but it's 20%, then the argument becomes, well, 20% of people cannot pay, so I have to target those 20%. And I have to create a new scholarship system that accommodates them. Then the question becomes, okay, we've had a scholarship system for so long. That scholarship system has disintegrated into something that the elites use to benefit their children. Yeah. Does that mean that you should abolish it or you should reform it? What does it mean for you? Does it mean that we had all these students going to Cuba? Was it open application process to do the medical course? Was it through some kind of fellowship program? What was the mechanism of admission? If there are issues to do with that, there's now, I'm told, a Northern Extraction scholarship program in which Northerners, regardless of where they are able to go for scholarships to attend schools in any part of Ghana. That means we have these mechanisms already in place. And your goal is to improve upon them and to expand them. If we can identify people of Northern Extraction, then, goodness gracious, we can identify people who are poor, because it's not just by name. It was just by name. Then anybody will change their name to another name for the scholarship. So there must be some mechanism we establish. And maybe it might be a matter of improving that process so that people can go to school. You understand where I'm going from this? Okay. Then you move on to say, okay, income stratification in this country is going to be very hard. So maybe I'll make it free for everybody in the rural areas because we identify that 9% of people there are poor. So the 10% is not a big problem. We are happy to waste some money because the vast majority will benefit. And urban will have to wait, or they can choose, if it's really about money, to go to school in the rural area. There's nothing that stops them from doing that. So there are ways in which you can do targeting if your issue is affordability. Now let's move on to the second set of people. Let's even agree that, so now we have accepted that we are not going to do targeting because for whatever reason, the first set of analysis or the first phase of the analysis still concluded that we should do it free for everybody. Okay, then the second question becomes implementation. How do you do that in a system where already people are paying fees? You have to stop them from paying fees. The question though is that there are schools of different levels of endowment. And because there are different levels of endowment, they have different running costs. If I have 4 laboratories in Presec, 2 dining halls, and I've got school transportation system with 3 buses, my cost of running all that is higher than somebody who has none of that in some school in Tetrim. So for that reason, because my costs are higher, I am charging additional fees beyond what the government gives every student. Unfortunately, it's the elite who, or the majority of them tends to be the elite, at least the upper middle class and the middle class, who get to attend these schools. So they're contributing some money is fair. Or they're contributing in the form of higher fees is fair. And it is actually true that if you go to some of these higher schools, they pay more fees than the cheap schools or the grade 4 schools. For that reason, if you attempt to stop parents from paying fees, then somebody will argue that there's an implementation dynamic in there, in that it's unfair. Because you are going to say the poor people go to Tetrim school and they get paid 100 cedis per student, but the rich child goes to Presec or Infansepim or Gehe and gets paid 2,000 per student. So why is the government spending more on rich students than poor students? So you, from an implementation point of view as a public service, you find difficulty in how you harmonize that. Are you going to bring down Presec to Tetrim, or you're going to bring Tetrim up to Presec? Whatever you do, it continue to shift towards the cost dynamic, but it makes your implementation issues more challenging. Some will argue that, no, that's not really a problem because we have a taxation system that is supposed to be progressive. So rich people pay more in taxes. And therefore, if their child benefits from top schools, they deserve it. I mean, that would be hard an argument to make if you are trying to build an egalitarian society. But let's say you are not. The argument is that when people have paid their taxes, if the money that still remains in their hands is such that the income distribution in the country is still highly unfair, then it still doesn't make sense. Because then the rich still benefits too much. How do you measure that? You use something that is called the Gini coefficient. In our country, the Gini coefficient has been getting worse. The Gini coefficient is that if you take the population and you split the population into certain bands, let's say 1%, 2%, whatever it is, and you take the top band and you look at how much of the whole money in the country goes into their hands, after taxation. You can do before and after taxation. But we are now using after taxation, Gini coefficient after taxation. Do the rich still earn more? If the rich still earn more, then you cannot tell me that by harmonizing the system and making it free for the rich because you are paying taxes, you are being fair. The rich is still earning too much. And because public services should not benefit the rich at the expense of the poor, that implementation challenge must be fixed. How you fix it, I don't know. Somebody might argue that because of that alone, it doesn't make sense. You understand me? But somebody might say that, well, what we will do is that over time, we'll just increase the trim to the level of respect. Over time. But to start off with, let's give something to everybody, even if you're giving more to the rich.
So what about the argument of progressively free?
No, all of them come to the same conclusion. In that, are you going to make it possible for the poor to benefit like the rich? Because the real problem we have from the implementation challenges that we have been having from a social welfare perspective is that poor people are suffering. That is the truth. That's what we are all agreed on. That if you are poor, you go to a bad Saito school. Because of that, you don't pass your BEC very well. So you go to a bad SHS. Because of that, you don't get enough access to facilities and teachers and a peer environment which promotes learning. Because of that, you don't get access because you don't pass your SHS, you don't get to university, etc., etc., etc. So the poor suffer at every level. And if you try to resolve that problem through an implementation mechanism.
So what should the solution be? I mean,
well, let me land on the cost issue finally.
Yeah.
Then the cost issue becomes, okay, we have a cost challenge. How much we spend on education per child? If my parent was contributing 10 cedis and the government said, stop, I'm going to take some money from here and there and add it to it. Unless you can convince everybody that you can match the private sector in how much a parent can invest in a child, you cannot maintain the same level of output. Unless you can, including inflation and the rest of it. And why can you not? You cannot, because when you take the country's economy, the percentage of money that we earn, that goes to the government, and the percentage of money that we earn as a country that goes to the private sector is so skewed to the private sector that it makes no sense to ask the government to bear the cost of education alone. 75% of the money goes to the private sector, 25% goes to the government. So if you're going to share the cost of education, you should at least share it 50-50. Except somebody cannot pay, then you target. Because otherwise, from an implementation point of view, unless you increase taxes dramatically to improve on them or to expand the amount of money that goes to the government, you cannot. That is where all the issues with the costing that Imani and other and co were doing were trying to portray, but they got lost. Then you say, okay, we have a budget now. We're already in deficit in that budget. Where are you going to get additional resources from? Then the argument is we're going to divert some money from oil and other places. Then the question becomes, but those monies are already prefixed in the law in terms of how you can spend them. And already we are getting so little. We're already spending 20% or more of our budget on education. So to expand it means someone else has to lose. If you try to make it oil, the problem is so little money out of that oil is available for any other spending that you cannot get all the resource from there. So where else are you going to get the resource? Then somebody say we'll cut waste. We will not pay judgment debts and the rest. Forgetting that the real reason why those wastes arose was due to institutional challenges which will cost money to fix.
Well, Bryce Evans, we'll take a break, our last break, and we'll be right back to nail the solution down. Stay with us. Welcome back to PM Express, and my guest is Bryce Simmons, Director of Development Research at Imani, and we're discussing education. So, Bryce, you were talking about waste in the system. Let's wrap up on that, and now we'll focus on what the solution should be.
So this is the third dimension, which is the cost dimension. And I was making the point that a lot of people argue that because there's waste in the system, you can eliminate the waste and use that to fund education. The challenge is that the waste arises out of institutional challenges. If you had an Attorney General's office, if you had a Bank of Ghana, etc., which were vigilant, which were committed, etc., you wouldn't have had, for instance, the Wyoming scandal. But to fix that problem actually involves money. It involves retraining. It involves better controls and management. It involves better systems management. It involves better finances. There were times when letters were missing because somebody didn't have access to that letter. So to stop waste, you actually have to implement reform. Reforms always cost money. When we're trying to shift from the old system, which was considered as wasteful, to the JHS, SHS system, donors had to put in almost $600 million to allow that transition to happen. Now, over time, of course, now we've got to a stage where donors are not the main drivers of our economy anymore. So my point is that waste is not an immediate and a short-term solution to garnering resources to address a problem, because it takes a long time for you to get the benefits of reforms that remove waste. Just like we've had ghost names for so long. We always know we had ghost names. It isn't only corruption that was preventing us from fixing the ghost names. We had to implement payroll management systems. We had to go biometric, etc., etc. All these things cost money. So it's not a short-term solution for garnering resources to address a challenge that you want to fix within the next administration.
So let's talk about, you've spoken a lot about the issue of free high school, progressively free. You lump them together as the same. They all come to the same. So what will be the alternative to these? What should we, as a country, bargain for?
There are a number of principles we can all agree on. One is that we are turning out graduates who are not sufficiently equipped to help us manage the risks and the challenges in our economy. We also turn out graduates who cannot harness fully the opportunities that are in our economy. We all agree on that. Secondly, we all agree that money should not be a barrier to somebody getting an education, because education is an endowment that a sensible state, a wise state, endows on all its citizens. Thirdly, we all agree that the current system we have does not incentivize teachers to give their best. There's no real reason why a teacher should put out their very best. Fourthly, we've all accepted that there's an industry education gap such that for the vast majority of employers, when the graduates come to their workplaces, they have to retrain them considerably before they are of use to their line of business. So these are four things we all agree on. There is no useless, well, no, maybe not useless, there's no furore over any of these things. How do we go about addressing them? That's what we should start off from. So we start off from the problems. Here are the problems, and then have a national debate about how we fix them. Some of the ideas, in my view, is, as I've already mentioned, is a reform of the scholarship secretariat. We have a scholarship secretariat that doesn't really offer any merit scholarships that I know of. I don't know of anybody who is getting a scholarship simply because in their district they perform so creditably and so remarkably that they got a scholarship. That's ridiculous. How can you have a scholarship secretariat that has no merit provisions? So there must be merit provisions that encourage students to excel. There should be scholarship schemes that encourage students to take on courses that are challenging. I would say even the technical courses that have become less prestigious, scholarships are one way to make them prestigious. So that is one clear goal in terms of addressing some of the challenges we have around finance and education at the level of the parents. You understand me? So at the level of the parents, because some parents cannot afford to pay for their children's education, because we need to incentivize parents to be interested in their children's education by rewarding them so that they don't pay when their children excel, we must use the scholarship scheme more effectively. That's a clear one that all of us can agree. Number two, we must find a way in making teachers less of civil servants. As public servants employed by the GES across the board, the ability of headmasters to implement disciplinary proceedings, to implement clear, targetable measures that changes the way that one school operates from another, and therefore allow the best systems to rise to the top. If there isn't competition, it's hard to know which is the best system. Management styles will differ. Management systems will differ. Schools must compete for us to find out what is the best management system for running a school. You can only do that if schools have sufficient autonomy. So turning schools into trust and to community-based organizations allows some of that to happen. That is clearly very important. We have to have a curricular development system that is dynamic, that is sufficiently driven by changes in the industry, changes in the community, changes in social media, etc., etc. We have a current system which is completely dominated by a few experts.
Give us examples of best practices for which you think that these recommendations will work for Ghana. Which countries implement these?
I mean, when you look at, let's take the United Kingdom, for instance, and look at charter schools in the United Kingdom. You were in the United Kingdom for a while.
Yeah.
You had the situation where we're having some of the similar debates we're having here. You had a public education system, which in the UK is called public education, but that's really private schools, like Ayrton and the rest, which have become so elitist that only the most academically gifted or the most wealthy parents could afford to send their children there. Then there are state schools which were highly dysfunctional, particularly the comprehensives. Then you had the grammar schools, which were, public schools, but had a different dimension that they had streaming, etc., 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 etc. So all these experiments were allowed to flourish through the emergence of charter schools, etc. So they implemented all these reforms, taking into cognizance the complexity that they had inherited. If you look at the way in which public-private partnerships have been promoted, because that was the other point I was going to make about some of the reforms we need to undertake. I think the central challenge we have is that we don't spend enough per student. partly because we have a low GDP, but partly also because we are also not mobilizing resources outside the government sector. Government is almost maxed out. This whole debate is a bit perfunctory because we're not recognizing the fact that already government provides a free educational system equivalent to any in the world apart from the communist countries. If you go to Scandinavia, the kind of benefit that we offer our students from a point of view of the relative equivalence is the same, in that the tuition is free, the buildings that the students study in is free, the materials are free. What are we asking to be made free is the kind of stuff that in almost every jurisdiction parents pay for: boarding, lodging, materials, etc. So we are asking for free plus, not really free, because already the school system is so free that countries that we are trying to compare ourselves with are at our level. Other countries that I've heard mentioned, like Kenya and Uganda, are actually trying to get to our level and haven't got there. So in Kenya, for instance, they have tried to make it free by abolishing tuition fees, but they are paying the tuition fees in terms of a capitation grant approach, which doesn't work very well. So they are trying to get to where we are now. So Ghana is trying to move far ahead in terms of the freeness point of view. When the real challenge is how do we get more money into the system so we can spend more per student? How you do that through public-private partnership. When you take schools like Gehe, they've got to the point where they can get the rich students, the rich parents to pay more because of the brand name in the school. Because they are not doing that, I'm seeing a slow exodus of students from these top-tier schools in the public system into the international schools, the GIS and the rest. What is annoying is that it's these same politicians who are arguing and campaigning and making noise, who are moving their children from these usually, used to be top schools, and moving them to even, more top schools in the, just because of the fact that there are better facilities there. Yeah. And these politicians are then coming back and telling us that the real problem is not the resources available in these schools, but it is definitely the resources available in these schools. That is why the international schools and the GIs are thriving, the Lincoln community schools and the rest. If we use the brand names that these schools have acquired, the Achimatas and the rest, we can actually get wealthy parents to pay more so that they cross-subsidize poor students who are then raised, like the grammar schools did in Britain. If you go to, like, highly academically gifted students in Britain, will go to Ayrton or Harrow or whatever, because the fees were being charged, very high fees, £20,000 and above, were being charged to parents, the schools could offer an amazing environment in which the poor students who go there on scholarship will flourish. Yeah. We have to find a way in which these schools can charge more to people who can pay. We need that in health. We need that in transport. We need that everywhere in our national life as we begin to implement social welfare programs. You know very well that in Britain, you don't get government benefits just because your face is pretty. No. You get government benefit because there's means testing and you demonstrate that you need that kind of assistance. And you qualify. We have to go there that route because we want to implement social welfare systems. When are we going to wait to implement those systems so we can offer free health and the rest of it? NHIS is collapsing because we're not charging the right premiums of those who can pay. If you don't have a system where you can discriminate based on income, you cannot implement social welfare programs and make them sustainable. We need to do that in education. We need to do that now. Doing that allows us to charge parents who can afford to make a contribution higher, which allows us to cross-subsidize so that we can allow the poor student to gain access to facilities that will improve on their health. The poor students who would have been identified by a means testing system. So, to repeat, the fundamental challenge is we are not spending enough on a student. $400 per student per year is too small. South Korea is spending $20,000 per student per year. And out of that 20,000, parents are bearing 11,000 of that. If you want a system that is effective, find a way to get more money into the system so students get more out of the school experience. To get more money means rich parents paying more, not abolishing fees for everybody, in my view. Whatever the goal, though, as I started at the very beginning, this is the beginning of a debate. I know that both parties are looking actively to the research community to help to refine some of these ideas. And we look forward to, after the election, the aftermath of the election, education continue to be at the very top of the agenda, and then all the parties shaping up. We congratulate the parties that they have made education so important in this debate, and we hope they will listen as various views come forth as to how we can make it actually effective for our country. Well, thank you very much, Bryce Simmons. This is just the beginning of the debate. My name is Stephen Anti, and thanks to you out there for making time to watch PM Express. Join us again tomorrow for another interesting edition of the show. Good night.